Well, what's up, everybody? It's Chad. We're back again with the second episode of Ask Chad Grassy Logic of season 4. We're back again, and I'm here today with my friend Amber. She's up in Colorado, but she does some cool stuff, and I'll let her introduce herself in a little bit. But thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chad.
Of course, I appreciate you coming on and everything. And I've been meaning to ask you. I think the timing hasn't really lined up just yet with us, and I'm glad it did this time. So, thank you so much. And without further ado, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Amber Loniger. I'm a cannabis attorney. I've done a lot of policy work as well. I started my career at Vicente Cedarburg, now Vicente, up here in Colorado. Moved out here from Florida. And then I actually took a remote job working for Trulieve, which is one of the larger multi-state cannabis operators based out of Florida. I worked there remotely, stayed in Colorado. Then in 2022, I started out on my own. I founded Purple Circle, my consulting firm, really with the goal of bringing accessible and affordable compliance and licensing services to the industry. And that has really just been an honor to be able to do that and work with small businesses, diversely owned businesses, et cetera. Um, and then, a couple of years ago, I started doing some work with Rod Kite. The Kite Law Office does a lot of hemp work. And so, got to see more that side of things. Around the same time, I visited Tennessee, and they felt the impacts of the hemp industry much larger than we did here in Colorado. So it was very eye-opening. And then most recently, I've had the pleasure of founding the One Plant Alliance with the D'Angelo brothers, Steve and Andrew D'Angelo, really with the goal of uniting all of these various sectors of the cannabis industry around, removing marijuana from the schedules and no longer treating any of these products like controlled substances. So, have been in the industry since 2017 at this point. It's been a journey and excited to be here with you today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for that wonderful intro. We're gonna dig into more of all of that, y'all. Don't worry. And so we're gonna pick it apart. And we're gonna figure out, everything that's within it too. So before I get into Purple Circle services, say that 5 times fast. So do you do like attorney work too as well, or is that just working with the lawyer office?
Yeah, so I also have my own law firm, AD Law, pretty low key, where I do some legal work here in Colorado, New Mexico. My family lives in New Mexico. My brothers live there for over 20 years now. My parents also live there now with my younger brother as well. So
Yeah.
I wanted to be able to do legal work in both states. And then I also do legal work through Kite Law, around the country. We're doing policy work with local counsel. But through Purple Circle, that's mostly just consulting in the policy space, licensing space. That's one of the biggest things I found is that people were paying lawyers a lot of money for licensing services when, consultants and compliance experts could help, meet those needs at a much lower cost.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of people just, think that paperwork is, very intimidating. And I get it, bureaucracy is, very annoying to deal with. And some people just don't want to deal with that. So, it's great that, you're providing those services because, we have some people that do that here in New Mexico too. And even I've done it a couple times, and consulted and help people with their licensing and everything. And, it's one of those things like it's just paperwork really in the end. But, some people it's just too confusing. And like, I get it, like sometimes it is. I was just lucky enough that, the military taught me how to navigate bureaucracy pretty well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
even
no,
still
you're
today,
absolutely right. Yeah, you're
definitely.
totally
So,
right. Just paperwork and, keeping all of those deadlines straight, especially when you start expanding into multiple markets and keeping all the licenses that you need in order to operate in all of those places can be, complex for sure.
oh yeah, definitely. And how have you seen the market really change for Colorado since like New Mexico went legal when it comes to the consulting side?
Yeah, I think, the Colorado market continues to evolve. In many ways, it's very mature.
Hmm.
In Denver, we've had a robust market for many, many years now. But it's all local authority based in many ways. So you've got towns like Colorado Springs that is just now starting their rec market. So it's very new there.
Hmm.
And each location is at a different point in that journey and needs different support. So I really try to, meet people where they are. Certainly since New Mexico legalized, that's had an impact. We don't obviously, necessarily build that into the model, but you do see people come across state lines to purchase cannabis, and then we don't know what they do with it afterwards. So you definitely do see those impacts when neighboring states start to legalize, especially in border towns. And, for instance, you guys in New Mexico are experiencing that same phenomenon with Texas for sure.
Mhm.
And, what's happening in Texas with hemp can have impacts on that. So it's all linked together for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, the little domino effect. Yeah, definitely, because Sunland Park, they're number 2 in the state in sales, but there's only 20,000 people that live there. So it's one of those things, and I knew that was going to be the case, especially when I drove to Sunland Park, when I was kind of checking it out. Because when I was growing up in the area, we didn't really go to Sunland Park. There was really no reason for anyone to go to Sunland Park until then. So when I was really checking it out, I was like, yeah, they're going to make a lot of money here. And
Yeah.
it's a temporary thing, and that's something that we had to learn from places like Colorado, was the fact that when you have a situation like this, you have to understand that that is temporary, because things are and will change. And they could change to the way that you think they are, and they could change ways that we have no clue we're even going to think of that. Because I didn't think that Texas was going to beat that hemp ban 3 times in a row this year or last year. And that was impressive. Like to beat any legislature that many times going after you that hard, and they did it 3 times. So like that was more impressive to me. And there's going to be more changes on the horizon, especially once federal legalization comes. That's going to be another big shift for the whole nation. In the rec states that are already there, and the ones coming online at the time, they may have an advantage because they're coming into a market where they already know what's needed of them, and especially federally, because we're going to be the ones that are going to be experimental children, and they're going to be like, oh, well, you guys need this and this and this and this and this. Oh no, don't forget that. And it's going to be the same stories that we heard when Washington and Colorado first legalized it. We heard the stories there, and like, okay, well, don't do this, and then that's why New Mexico, we took a total different approach to legalization than most other states in general. Including Colorado, because I've talked before too. My dad's from Colorado, and I spent a lot of my childhood there too, and Southern Colorado and everything. And seeing the differences between when they first went legal to today, it is, you could tell, a total mature market. But on the conversation to that, where do you think Colorado needs to go next? For the next improvements for the state.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. And I think you have a lot of states around the country that have adopted some form of a cannabis program. And within those programs, the licensed cannabis businesses are really struggling for one reason or another. And the issues are all, really different state to
Mhm.
state. But I think generally the theme is somewhat the same, that these businesses are overregulated in many ways, and the burdens that come along with compliance basically stamp out any chance at success through no fault of the operators.
Yeah.
So in my mind, and you saw some interesting activity here, last fall, expanding these programs to, reduce some of those regulatory burdens and open up additional access channels. And,
Mhm.
that's one thing that hemp has really demonstrated is in some states is there is clear demand for these products, especially hemp-derived beverages, to be available in liquor stores and where alcohol is sold and consumed. There is a huge online marketplace, e-commerce activity that's happening. So, the dispensary model in many ways was a compromise to
Mhm.
get us out of complete prohibition. And I think in many ways, we've moved beyond that compromise at this point. We have more leverage. The streets aren't burning down, like cannabis isn't this end all, just terrible thing that a lot of people initially thought it was. In fact, it can create jobs, it can create revenue for the state, it
Mhm.
can do all of these wonderful things while also, addressing an illicit market that is giving people products that aren't tested. And of course there's challenges within cannabis testing, but we at least know where these products are produced. We know who to hold accountable if people are made sick for one reason or another. So it's important that we start to bring these products into a regulated environment. It's clear that prohibition doesn't work.
Mhm.
But the dispensary model, in many ways, I think we've moved beyond that, and the demand for more access at more channels is clear. So, there was a Colorado Hemp Beverage Coalition sort of started here last year, and it's really interesting because very early on, we severely restricted hemp products to like almost no THC and a really high CBD to THC ratio, which New Mexico recently did as well in emergency in rulemaking.
Yeah.
But that group was aimed at providing those THC drinks with additional access points here in Colorado. And there was going to be legislation introduced this session, and now this federal stuff has kind of happened. So I think the future remains a bit unclear. And I wasn't involved in that effort. Some folks at Vicente were, and some folks criticized that effort because they were also somewhat involved in an effort to restrict these hemp products in the first place. So, I think if looking back over any of our careers, you would say you wouldn't go back and do something differently. You're probably in the rare exception here, like if you've been in this space for 10 years plus, assuredly knowing what you know now, you would go back and do some things differently. And I think it's important for us all to remember that, hold each other accountable, but then also, move forward in a new way together. And that's the only way that this is really, that we're going to be able to accomplish our goal, which is ultimately descheduling. So it's tough sometimes, but you're seeing this happen here in Colorado, where we are leaders of this movement, and there are at least groups of folks who are ready to embrace the progress that hemp can offer, in a safe and regulated way. And I'm not sure anybody knows exactly what that looks like yet, but I do think that's the next step. It's expanded access. It's building on what we've already built.
Definitely. And actually, I think you and I've, talked about this on LinkedIn before, because, you're fairly active on there, and, we kind of look at each other's posts, and I'll read yours, and I read a bunch of people's on there. And actually recently, for some reason, it got taken over by a bunch of cannabis people. So there's a bunch of cannabis stuff on LinkedIn, and I'm glad to see it, because there's a lot of, very smart people, very, professional people that share some really great insights, some really great studies. And one thing that I've talked about on there is the dispensary model is exactly what you said. It was a compromise, and it's dying. And if we're sitting here betting on the dispensary model, you're already behind. And I keep telling people that here in New Mexico is like, you guys need to stop staying in this whole dispensary lane and this licensing thing, like, because that's not the future of cannabis or for New Mexico. The future is Walmart. The future is movie theaters. The future is sporting events above high school. The future is everywhere that alcohol is accessible right now. That's where cannabis is going to be. And we're seeing that already real time with hemp. And maybe not here in my state, specifically the way it is, like maybe in like Illinois, where I heard about, in certain bars and stuff like that, they're selling the hemp drive drinks. And we're barely getting it in gas stations here, like at Circle K's, like the hemp drinks and hemp drives. But we had legalization for such a long time that some people didn't really see the need for it. And it was showing up spotty here and there in other places, but you're starting to see it a lot more available here in New Mexico. And that's something that I don't think it's going to stop, with the hemp beverages and stuff. And that was something I wanted to, like talk later in the show, but, let's talk about it now, because, a lot of the United States, we're not drinking that much, including myself, I don't drink at all anymore. And, the younger generations, they don't either. And so that's going to be a continuing trend. And we're seeing places like Texas Roadhouse here in Las Cruces. They're starting to serve mocktails over there, because I think they're starting to see their alcohol sales just start to tank. And don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of people who drink, but if it's noticeable if they're starting to offer stuff like that. And that's where we're going to see cannabis go, is that direction, is to that one. But we're also going to see the people who are either going to find out they can't drink anymore, they don't want to drink anymore, or the younger generation is getting older, they want an alternative. Those are going to be the people that are going to be the ones that are going to start experimenting with the cannabis drinks more than like a regular cannabis user like myself. Because I tell this to the regular cannabis people all the time, and they don't understand it. I said, and I tell them, give it about 10, 15 years, and cannabis drinks will probably be the number one way people consume cannabis. And it's not going to be us regular consumers that are going to be the ones that are going to do it. It's going to be the newcomers that are coming in that are going to be the ones that make it the number one, because either they're used to it, or they just don't want to smoke, or whatever the reason is. I kind of feel that the drinks are just kind of take over in that sense, and they're just more convenient, like I can take it anywhere. Like the Karen isn't going to get mad at me at the concert because her kids smell like smoke, because she's probably having a drink in her hand too, so it's just one of those things that I think um the future is just going to tell us. But I don't know, we'll see how right I am and wrong I am, or how we are in the future. But I do think that the dispensary model is dead, and we need to stop trying to protect it so much, because we're hindering ourselves a lot, because it was a compromise, and it's time for us to evolve. And that's one thing that I've been touting here in New Mexico, but it's going to take us a little bit to kind of figure that out, because we're barely in year 4. We're just getting to year 4, and it's usually about 5 years when you start feeling like a stabilized market, and we're just getting stabilized. So I think in a couple of years they'll start to notice that, oh shit, you're right, we need to get away from this. And who knows, between now and the next presidential election, who knows what's going to happen on the federal side. I really hope some descheduling happens, not rescheduling. I think you and I both can agree on that. The rescheduling thing is um, a, a mistake, essentially. It just creates more confusion than there already is, because we're seeing this attack on hemp, which then is attack on cannabis, because they're the same damn compounds, and then everyone gets confused, and so it's just a big old mess and everything. So yeah, I hope that people start to wake up to that fact too, and I'm so glad that you echoed it too, because that was something hard to get to people to understand, because they're like, my license, like some
Yeah,
people are really
yeah.
attached to that license, and I get it. It costs a lot of
I get
money,
it
but
too. Yeah,
yeah,
they've invested a lot of money into those
yeah,
licenses, like I get it. And the harm that they might face as a result of a future that doesn't look like what we thought it would look like, that
hmm,
that harm is there. We need to
yeah,
figure out how these dispensaries fit into that world. And I do think that there's a role for dispensaries as we move forward,
yeah,
definitely in the sense of medical patients
hmm,
who don't want to go the pharmaceutical route, don't want to grow their medicine at home. The dispensary is a great option for those folks. I think dispensaries should be able to sell other products. Why are they limited to cannabis? Let's create real opportunities for these businesses that are really struggling right now, and
yeah,
they're struggling in many cases through no fault of their own. In fact, they've been advised by different professionals to do exactly what they're doing, and that the result would be much better than what it's actually been. So it is a tough equation. Like, we have these folks who have invested everything into this, but you're right, alcohol sales are going down. Even the impacts of GLP-1s on the alcohol industry, like, you're seeing this evolution, and alcohol is looking to fill those margins, right? So they're looking at THC drinks as a potential, channel for them. And that's where I think it's really important that we're all involved in this conversation, whether it's THC drinks derived from hemp, or cannabis flower, or edibles, or CBD only products, whatever it is. Like, we all need to come together and be involved in this conversation. Otherwise, like I say, if you're not writing the laws that govern your business, someone else is, and they will write it in a way that benefits them exclusively. So we need to make sure everyone's at the table, small business, e-com, everybody needs a seat, so that we can make a system that works for everyone. And cannabis is different than alcohol in some ways, because it is a medicine for people.
mm,
And so we have to be cognizant of that and appreciate that there are nuances there. But we are approaching a system with this rescheduling order to Schedule 3. And within that same executive order from President Trump, there was also language about reversing what Congress did to hemp, revising the definition of final hemp product to be more inclusive of at least full spectrum CBD products that often have these higher levels of THC. So, even within that executive order, you saw elements of this, way forward potentially that's new for people. They didn't necessarily expect this to happen. But if you look at Canada, where they're, a little ways ahead of us, they tried to push CBD only products into the dispensary system. And as a result, those products are very expensive. They're taxed at an exorbitant rate, and it didn't work. We need
mm,
access to CBD products outside of the dispensary system for sure.
yeah,
Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of issues with folks who need that access. And I think a lot of that, you're looking at our parents who are giving those products to their children. And if we don't protect that, then those parents could face arrest, criminalization, or loss of custody of their children over giving them a product that is somewhat comparable to alcohol, even though it's medicine.
Yeah.
So like we just need to be really careful about that in a nuanced way. But everything out of that executive order I felt like was positive. It's a step in the right direction. It obviously didn't do anything really. It was highly symbolic, and we're now waiting on these other actors to do these things that the president directed them to do. So a lot remains to be seen. But having an executive order about this is historic. And we do need to be cognizant of the fact that this is being politicized in many ways, and decide where our line in all of that is for sure personally. But there are a lot of people actively lobbying Congress and the president to move forward on this. And with the hemp ban, they've got until November to
Yeah.
essentially get a change. Otherwise, the law that passed last year will go into effect. So, the timeline is sensitive, and maybe that means that there's an opportunity for even greater reform within that timeline.
Yeah, and that's what I'm hoping for too. And those are good points. And with that being said, we can segue into what I was going to talk about in our next topic is just kind of updating everybody what's happened since the season ended last October, because a lot has happened. And that's one of the things that happened was, yes, President Trump did sign an executive order to essentially finish what had started under the Biden administration. To kick them in the ass a little, say, hey, we want to get this done. Can you please finish it, restart it, whatever you got to do? We just we want it done. The only thing that my concern is they kept calling it medical marijuana inside of it, which tells me that they're going to separate by definition again. And if they do that, a lot of people that think they're going to get tax relief may not get tax relief because it separates it again by definition, just like they did with hemp. And so that's where my concern is. I'm like, oh man, because like there's so many people that are hoping on that, and I kind of saw that right away, and I was like, well, yeah, but they have to. We don't even know what the definition is going to be. So when that the order came out, and I actually saw the language medical marijuana, I was like, ooh, that don't sound good, because they're not going to call it cannabis, which kind of blankets it more altogether versus separating again like they did with hemp, because we know hemp and cannabis the same damn thing these days. The only thing that's different is the plant pretty much just gets to mature a little bit more, so that way it's cannabis versus pulling a little bit early when the THC is a little low. And don't get me wrong, there's certain plants that do have higher CBD or whatever, but on the whole, for the most part, hot hemp became a term for a reason. It's because people were running into the issues of either growing in a warmer environment like here in New Mexico, or allowing it to sit too long, and then the compounds degraded into something else, and then it turned into THC, and then they couldn't sell it. And one thing I wanted to pick up on the dispensary thing is, yeah, I agree there is going to be a space for them too in the future before we move on. But I kind of feel they're going to be more niche, like you're talking about, like the medical side, or they're going to be more focused on a certain product, or we're going to be more, connoisseur kind of thing. That's kind of where I see them going, because here in New Mexico, that's kind of what our liquor stores are. They're more for the niche products. They're more for the higher end things that you want to get. And that's cool, because it separates itself from, just like, oh, I got to get my weed from Walmart. Well, if you go to Walmart, you're probably getting mids. That's fine. Or they could get some fancy stuff every now and then, or some upper mids. But if you want to get the real good stuff, you'll go to a dispensary, or, like how a liquor store is now, where you find more of the rare stuff. So yeah, I do see a space for them in the future, but having the availability everywhere is going to be key. And going further, because not everybody wants to go to the shop, or wants to go to a dedicated store for the thing that you want. Some people just want to go to an all in one place, and that's fine. I should be able to go to Los Fiesta Food here in Las Cruces, which is a grocery store, and and they also have a liquor section. I can get my taco ingredients, I can get my meat, my salsa, and I can also get my weed. And that'd be kind of cool, right? Gino's like, why not?
One-stop shop, sir.
Right. So
That's
right. Well, getting back on track on the conversation and everything. Yeah. So Trump did sign that, and that was back in, I believe, in December. So it really wasn't that long ago. We're talking a few weeks ago. We keep hearing word of, like, oh, by the end of January, by this time. And then, I'll see articles of, the DEA saying that, well, we're not going to do jack shit. And then I'll see articles of, Congress saying, well, we're trying to do this, so we're going to pass this. And, I think I saw one yesterday. I think the Senate passed something to help out, but, I'm not too sure what exactly is in the language of that. I haven't had a chance to dig into it, but we're getting updates on it all the time. We're just not too sure when all of this is going to happen. So I hope soon we get some kind of word, because just sitting in limbo kind of sucks. But who knows? They could start the process all over again. If that's going to be like one of the worst case scenarios, is we could end up starting all over again. But I don't see why they would, when it's mostly done. We're just waiting on decisions. So we'll see with that. And if you all of you, those who were paying attention this whole time when the season was off, you probably already knew some of the stuff already. If not, great, you learned something today. So yeah, that's do you have anything else before we move on to the next thing that happened while we were off air?
Yeah, I'll say, under that executive order, there are some folks who think it may even be possible to do like an interim rulemaking process, essentially like emergency rules to
Yeah.
reschedule, sort of circumventing even the process that was started under Biden. So, I think that future sort of remains to be seen, like how the DOJ may or may not move forward with this. But, I don't think we saw a single state go adult use before they went medical.
Yeah.
And I kind of look at it the same way at the federal level. And even though in my heart of hearts, I do believe that descheduling is the right answer, it's this classic argument of like incremental progress versus holding out for the final goal. And a lot of people would say we take whatever progress we can get and wake up the next morning and ask for more. But I think you are right. Schedule 3, there are a lot of questions in my mind as to, what that means, and, what the future would look like under that world. But, whether or not that is even going to happen remains to be seen. So, we sort of try to deal with the hypotheticals one step at a time, and the reality first and foremost, which is still this dichotomy between the federal government and states that have legalized and regulated cannabis. And I don't think that dichotomy is going away anytime soon.
No, and I've said this many times too. The federal government doesn't even really know how this is going to look either. They're still figuring it out themselves, because they're not too sure. This is new territory for our country. We haven't done something like this before, so for them to have to create the process, they don't even know. Like you can find 1,000,001 articles right now that's telling you what's going to happen and what to expect next, and you can get a million of different answers that could be correct, because we're just not sure yet. And that's why I'm so skeptical, like, because one, we haven't seen any action, and two, there's just too many questions that are left unanswered so far too. And I can't blame the federal government, because they don't know either. Because like I said, new territory. So we can only really guess at this moment. But let's hope that this is good progress for us. Let's hope that in the end, it's not just handed over to someone that we don't want, and then we're never given a chance, an opportunity, and things are just kind of ripped away from us. Because there's even people here in New Mexico that are thinking this means that consumption lounges are done for some reason. I have no clue. They're like, yeah, going around saying that, yeah, once that happens, the federal government's going to come down and shut down all the lounges. I was like, they can do that right now. Like, if they wanted to, they can literally come and shut down everybody right now if they wanted to. What are you talking about? So there's a lot of confusion out there, and there's a lot of people that are kind of agitated and like mad at the wrong people, and so they're kind of going at the wrong spaces. And so I just hope for everyone's sake that they make up their minds soon on this situation, because it's getting a little ridiculous. So
tough.
next I'm going to move on to it is tough. We're going to move on to the next conversation that kind of really happened while we were gone, and we kind of touched on this a little bit ago. Is we're talking about there's been more studies coming out that alcohol is being consumed less in our country. And younger adults are starting to use cannabis a little bit more. Now, the articles that I see that are talking about that, they kind of make it seem like it's a bad thing. Like, oh, adults are using cannabis at an alarming rate. And then we also got those articles of the scromitting and stuff like that. And like, that doesn't help any case of anything. But I kind of felt this. We mostly made fun of the scromitting articles I saw. I mean, I even made a meme about it too. And we're kind of like, oh, come on, dude, really? Scromitting? And like the way the articles kind of set it up is like, you take one puff of that stuff, man, and you're throwing up for the rest of your life, and it's kind of ridiculous. I don't know if you saw any of those.
I did not see any of those, but I was just the whole thing is just, I don't know, it's silly. What did you call it? The fuckery?
Yeah, the fuckery.
The fuckery. Yeah, it's just silly.
Reefer madness.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
is.
there you go. Yeah.
And it is. And I told everybody, be careful with this hemp attack, because last year in New Mexico during the legislature, I'm sure you remember too, they were trying to do that hemp ban thing. And you and I talked about it a few times, and, kind of, pondered what was going to happen, where we're to go. And I told everybody, I said, this is a slippery slope, everybody. You start attacking hemp, you attack cannabis, because the same arguments that they're using for this can and will be used against us. And it didn't take long for that to become true, because almost right after, we started getting the Scromitting articles, we started getting these bans. And now here in New Mexico, the environmental department came up with their emergency rules. And that was another thing that happened while the season was off, is New Mexico environmental department came down with their emergency rules, which is pretty much just solidifying the rules that they made last year and making them permanent. And it's pretty much just banning the hemp derived compounds from being in regular cannabis too. So they're going around like dispensaries themselves and checking. So it's not just the CCD you got to worry about. And it's not just the local governments you got to worry about. Now you got to worry about the environmental department. And on top of it, we still have that issue with the water hauling thing. And so now you have the state engineer office going around to certain farms harassing people again about the the water hauling thing. So you have all these different entities, and I keep saying this again too, and you said it yourself already. We need deregulation of some sort, because we're getting attacked from all angles, and it's not really fair. Like alcohol gets to operate pretty much harassment free, and cannabis, we haven't really hurt anyone ever. And we're getting the brunt of everything. Alcohol made the mistakes, but for some reason we're getting all the punishment. And what's up?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Breathing deep.
I don't have the camera on me. No, I keep thinking, that you get all these, people that are, villainizing cannabis in that sense, comparing it to alcohol, bringing up all the history that New Mexico has with alcohol yet, and yet still we've been legal for nearly 3 years, 4 years. 4 years.
We've it's actually 2021. It's 5.
Okay, I'm trying to go by our anniversary. We're in season 4, close enough.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty close.
But we've been legalized for at least 3 years right now, and I have as yet to see any statistics from law enforcement, from criminal stuff, or anything else that has to go with how much worse things have gotten since it's gone legal.
Yeah,
as opposed to how it compares to alcohol or anything else. Not one thing is out there. Just recently we had the police get 129 tickets out there in an hour and a half, and most of them were because people just don't know how to drive. And I haven't seen anybody, and all of those little stops, everything else like that, I haven't seen any statistics about driving while under the influence of cannabis or anything else like that any more than our DUI statistics have gone down.
Yeah.
So I don't see how they're doing that. And you're right about how they're demonizing the whole thing, because those arguments that you have, the reefer madness thing that you mentioned, were the same things and those same arguments that were being made on the Senate floor when Rand Paul was trying to add his amendment, because Tennessee got hit hard by that hemp ban. Oh wait, Tennessee, absolutely. Kentucky, I don't know, one of those ones.
Kentucky, you mean?
Kentucky. But everybody else on the other side was coming up like, we have access to, children have access to these things. I'm going like, they have access to alcohol too, but
it's a great point, right? And like, I think the research that we really need, it's just not there. And so when you hear about these health related claims, it's hard to refute, because we don't have any research really either way. I do think it's important as an industry that we, separate ourselves from tobacco and pharmaceuticals and acknowledge that there could be some health risks for some people by consuming cannabis. Everyone has their own endocannabinoid system within their bodies, and cannabis interacts with those systems differently, body to body. And I myself have experienced anxiety smoking various strains, and different impacts. So I think it's important that we get to a place where that research is there, that we can really reliably count on in the face of claims like the Scromitting that you're seeing, the timing of which was definitely suspect. But there's a reason that really we shouldn't be using the word intoxicating in connection with these products. Alcohol is intoxicating because it is toxic to your body. Cannabis has not been proven to be toxic to your body. So we're using this term intoxicating a lot, and I struggle to find the right term. Psychoactive isn't even necessarily right. I'm not a scientist. But we need to be a little bit careful with our language. Because you're right, the prohibitionists are absolutely putting out all out front against us right now. They are, leading this charge against hemp. They are turning around and using those same arguments against cannabis, which cannabis just acquiesced to in the hemp conversation, right? We were like, yeah, you're right. And then they turn around and use the arguments against us, and we can't say anything because we just agreed with you 2 months ago about it. So
Yep.
it makes it really challenging. And the same thing happened here in Colorado when they were trying to cap the potency in our regulated cannabis products. And that thankfully failed. But these prohibitionists are leading charges, and I know we've got this to talk about too, in various states to completely repeal regulated cannabis programs. That, you've got some folks who believe that those programs are flawed enough that maybe that is the right answer, burn it down and start over sort of camp. And like I hear those arguments because these programs are struggling in a number of ways, but we need to build on what we've built already. I can't really support taking a step backwards in any case. But absolutely, they are, really compiling some compelling evidence against us, and especially these products that are attractive to children. They're mimicking, everyday candies that children love, like Skittles and Nerds and other things, and they're out there on the shelves, and they have THC in them, and that is, of course, putting a really, really bad mark on our name and needs to stop. But at the same time, while that is happening in hemp right now, you bet your ass, when I moved to Denver a couple years ago, it was happening in regulated cannabis too, So it's all a learning curve and like weeding out those bad practices over time. But that happened in tobacco largely through settlement agreements as a result of bad behavior. And I think
Yeah.
cannabis needs to set itself apart and step forward and say, no, we are going to set the standard here in a good way before it comes to that.
Yeah, and I've said this many times before, we need to self-police ourselves in the industry instead of relying on the government so much. And that's true all around. We see ourselves getting, over controlled by governments everywhere. And, and it's from all levels and in different industries too. And just cannabis, we just kind of get the brunt of it. We're federally illegal. We get that, but at the same time, we get taken advantage of from our government, the contractors sometimes that we deal with, landlords that we deal with, suppliers that we deal with, banks, insurance companies, they all think that we're raking in the money and this and that. And so they're going to, get their money from us too, by all means. But at the same time, that's just not the reality. Like a lot of these people in the industry, we're struggling, we're trying to get by. And, there's so many regulations and things in the way that it costs money to do it. And then don't get me started on, the licensing costs. Not here in New Mexico. I can't complain here in New Mexico. Ours are actually very, very cheap. And I think that's one of the good things that we did is we didn't price people out of the industry like other states did too. And that's something that they were talking about wanting to do here in New Mexico is raise the prices because it'll keep the riffraff out. But at the same time, you're pricing people out of the industry at that point. And New Mexicans were poor to start out with. So what you're telling me is you just want rich dudes from out of state to come in and do it right when a lot of the times they don't do it right.
There's rich riffraff too.
Exactly. Like there's rich ghetto motherfuckers too. Yeah, exactly. Like a ghetto don't start at poor and don't end at poor either.
No, and I mean,
you can
you're
be rich
absolutely
ghetto.
right. New Mexico has a really great program in many ways that I wish more people were looking to as an answer to a lot of these problems. I know we've talked about like license caps and production quota limits and that sort of stuff, and there's a lot there that we can dig into, but it's a really special market. And, I hope that whatever we come up with federally, largely mirrors that market in many ways, that it's giving opportunity to small businesses. And that really the consumer and the patient is the priority. They're getting the benefits of price competition and quality comparisons and getting the best products for the best prices. That's the way these programs should operate.
Yeah, and it keeps me honest as an operator, like the competition does, because like if I'm doing something, that a customer doesn't like and they don't realize it because there's no one else there, well, I'm cheating. But if there's someone else in competition, well, he's going to come up with something else and I have to compete with that. And to be honest, that's how it should be because you come up with a better product at the end of the day. And, not only does the customer win, but you win because you had to innovate. And you had to get out of your comfort zone. And like, I know everyone hates competition because they want a participation trophy, but that's just not the way business really works. Like you're going to have to fight for it and you're going to have to, work hard. You know, it wasn't just getting the licensing that makes you, you know, makes you successful. You have to do the work that goes along with it too. And
Yeah.
I think some people just didn't realize that when they got into the industry, that, you know, the piece of paper that says you can sell weed isn't where it stops. You know, it's just, that's just where it begins. And I told people that too, same thing with legalization. You know, like, we legalized it, guys, but the fight just started. You know, like, I
Yeah.
hope you guys just
Yeah.
know, like, we just started.
Yeah.
We're in inning
Absolutely.
2.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Long, long journey. And yeah, I mean, the only reason that you're, you know, disliking competition is you're afraid of it, right? And that fear comes from a place that you know you can't compete. And unfortunately, you have a lot of states that have done the opposite of New Mexico and only allowed, you know, 10 vertical operators in their program. And as a result, you know, one of the 10 has a huge monopoly over that state's industry, has captured pretty much the entire regulated market, doesn't have to compete on price or quality, so everyone loses. And then that actor fights to maintain that monopoly and expand it, right? So then they're coming into other states that weren't crafted that way and saying, here's all the problems that you can fix by capping your licenses. And you know, and it's sensitive because there are some times that a license truly has no value. It's not even that there's more work to do, but it's the supply chain was structured in a way that this license isn't really a part of it, and you
Mhm.
can't make money. And in those situations, I'm all for stopping licensing. Like, I don't want people falling into those traps of, you know, spending a lot of money to get this license for, like, God forbid, in Alabama, a third party waste disposal license,
Yeah.
where like everyone is just going and getting that license themselves so that they can dispose of their own waste. You know, like, nobody wants a third party waste disposal service. And so this licensee just is totally screwed, you know?
Yeah.
They can't go out and get new clients. Their client pool is limited. So it's complex and it's nuanced, but I love what New Mexico has done in that if you do start to face saturation, which a lot of people love to throw around that term as an issue in the market,
Mhm.
that you can have controls on it. You can bring down canopy space. You can make it so it's not as saturated of a market without stopping licensing or telling businesses that they can't, you know, apply for these permissions anymore. So, you know, definitely a lot to unpack there just in the licensing realm itself. And my hope is that, you know, eventually we get to a place where states are a lot more like New Mexico, and then even then we're progressing to a place where, like in Texas, how easy it was to get a hemp license. You
Yeah.
could go online and apply for it and have it in your inbox the same day. Like, it was so easy. Now, of course, these new rules, they're talking about raising the license fees from like $250 to $25,000, which is crazy,
No, it's ridiculous.
because they are trying to get a hold of it somehow.
No.
But you know, my hope is that eventually you see licensing programs that are just a easy check the box. That's not even a formal part of like the business strategizing session. You know, like,
Yeah.
can we do this financially? Do we have the expertise to do this? Will the market support our business? Like, those are the important questions, not can I get a license? You
Yeah.
know, so we just need to shift the way we think about it.
Yeah, yeah, you know, and I get, you know, people, everybody that's in this has spent a lot of money to get in it, but you know, we're not all, you know, guaranteed to survive at the end of the day. And
Yeah.
I think that's one thing that other people need to realize too, is that yeah, we all spent
Capitalism.
money to be here, but you know, it doesn't mean I'm going to win. So it's like
Yeah, I mean,
gambling,
that's
you know.
capitalism. That is what
Yep,
this country was founded on. It's that
100%.
you are gonna succeed if you have the best products and you're the best
Mhm.
customer service. Like, that's how you succeed.
Yeah.
So the fact that we're trying to, like, you know, structure this through government regulation is just like so mind-blowing to me. Like, it's so anti-American in many ways. So my hope is, you know, we can start to move away from that. But it was a compromise, like we said at the start.
Yeah, yeah, it was. And you know, we're moving away from it. And you know, like we said, you're just creating a when a new supermarket opens up in a new area, you know, one of the boxes that they're going to check is alcohol and cannabis, hopefully in the future. And it won't be as a crazy process to do it like it is now, and all these other
Yeah.
crazy regulations. And you know, we'll get there one day. And we are getting to an area of more normalization. The stigma of cannabis is dying. Don't get me wrong, very, very, very slowly. But it is dying every year. I feel like a little bit of a stigma kind of pulls back a little bit. I feel like last year was a little bit of a going backwards for us because you know the studies and stuff. But when things are dying, they fight very hard. And I kind of feel that's the, the alcohol industry side. It's dying, and it's dying hard. And, it's not going to go out with a fight, and I can't blame it. They're trying to just, protect their livelihood. And, my own brother is a part of that. He makes cider over in Durango, Colorado. He makes hard cider out there, and he's feeling it too. And he made a joke to me. I saw him a couple years ago, when I went over there to visit, and I told him I don't drink anymore. He said, "Oh, so you're the reason why I'm losing money." And I was like, "Oh shit, you're feeling it too, huh?" Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, I had to do
Yeah.
it for my health, bro. I can't do it anymore. So, it's one of those things. My brother's gonna have to figure that out and shift whatever way, or do some things. I have no clue, but
Perhaps
Yeah.
you can suggest some, CBD infused ciders.
maybe I can help my
I
brother
mean,
out with
I
that. I
don't
don't know.
know.
We'll see.
Yeah,
Help a brother out,
absolutely.
man.
Yeah.
Help a brother out.
So
Well, and it's
it's up to
interesting
him though.
too. Like you saw the alcohol distributors, like the wholesalers, come out in support of hemp. And
Yeah.
then the alcohol manufacturers were the ones right at the end who came out against. And if you think about that system, the manufacturing of mainstream alcohol as we know it today is highly monopolized as well. And they want
Yes.
to keep it that way. Whereas
Yeah.
the wholesalers, they're looking for that product diversity. They're looking for
Mhm.
options outside of that monopolization. And so
That's true.
hemp drinks were a new avenue for them from people outside of that equation that were pricing them out and being difficult and not giving them options. So it's really interesting to see how all of this is shaking out. And my hope is that the alcohol manufacturers will come around, the Coca-Colas and the General Mills and the Nestle's of the world will come around. But you have to think that they're initially sort of supporting the ban because they haven't figured out how to craft a system that works in their favor. And they're
Yeah.
not involved in this system yet. And so let's take time to figure out a system that works for us. And that's fine. But we will also want to make sure it works for the small businesses who have been propping up this system for the past 2 decades.
Yeah.
So it's a nuanced conversation for sure. But I don't view alcohol as an enemy by any means. We need their support. We need their lobbying power. We absolutely should be coming together with those folks, and there's various groups that are to various
Yes.
levels.
Yeah.
My issue then becomes like, okay, like anybody who's working with anything related to THC or cannabis should be at least somewhat committed to criminal justice reform, and it's not quite there yet, for some of
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
folks. So we got to connect those dots for people at times, because ultimately, if you're working with a THC-based product, you are working with a plant, even if you don't touch it, that has resulted in this huge impact to mainly Black and brown communities. And if we can't
Yeah.
acknowledge that and start to repair that harm, then we shouldn't be a part of this conversation.
Yeah.
So that's one difficult piece with it. But I'm all for the support. These are lobbyists that the federal government trusts. Honestly, the TTB FDA system is one that we could easily implement for most THC products and just build them into a system that already exists with GMPs and other things, with some caveats for sure, because GMPs can be a lot for some people. But there are systems in place already in those industries that we can lean on to give us pathways forward here.
Yeah, definitely. Those are really good points. You bring up something that I haven't thought of before. How monopolized the alcohol industry is, and I think what we did in cannabis is we made people realize that you don't have to do that, because microbrews haven't been around for very long. I think the 80s or the 70s is when they actually legalized microbrews, and it took even longer for them to
Yeah.
kind of catch on to where they are now. And then
Yeah.
we noticed, oh shit, this was a better route.
Yep, yep.
And
And
then
that
all
largely
the
came
big
from
companies
within.
just bought the microbrews.
What's up?
Yeah, and you're seeing some consolidation now for sure, but
Yeah.
that movement largely came from within. Big Alcohol allowed and supported a pathway for craft alcohol,
Mhm.
and that's where it came from, and eventually supported a pathway for home brewing too.
Mhm.
And we
Yeah.
need all of those things too, right? We need craft
Yeah.
cannabis, we need home grow, we need all of those
Mhm.
things too. So this system has already been created that allows us to eventually have access to all of those things nationwide. Home grow is really like one of my biggest passions, and the fact that we've regulated cannabis in some states without allowing home grow is just mind blowing to me.
Crazy. Yeah.
But it is happening across the country, and that's part of that regulatory capture conversation. They don't want people to be able to grow their own weed. So, we need to be really honest about that and make sure that from within as an industry, we're preserving lanes like that as well, even if we can't make money off of it.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like not having home grow, with cannabis legalization is just prohibition with perks.
Yeah.
Because it's not full legalization. You're not allowing me to, if I want to, grow for myself. You're gonna make your money. And like, to be honest, most people that try to grow stop. Either they go through the first harvest, they didn't like how much work it was, they don't get to their first harvest, they try a couple weeks and they give up. Like most of them
Yeah.
give up, and it's a very few small percentage of people that actually keep going. I've been growing for like 14 years, and I'm just one of the very few people that didn't stop. And just it keeps growing and keeps learning and stuff like that. But that's just me. Most people that I've tried to teach to grow, most of them don't continue to grow like I have.
Yeah.
And it's very few and far in between. So like we're not competition for anybody, and I
Mhm.
still go to the dispensary. I still buy stuff on the market because I
Yeah.
want to try different things. I want to try the drinks. I want to try someone else's flower. I want to try some micro, grows flower. He's putting out some fire, but it's very limited and stuff like that. That's really what I want to do. But you brought out some really good points, and I wanted to talk about this very last thing too. When we have about like 8-9 minutes left of the show, and this last thing, I wanted to make sure we talked about it, is there's actually some states, and this is what's happened since the show ended last time, is there's some states are trying to roll back their adult use stuff. And I wouldn't say it's the states themselves. This is off of voter, referendums. And here in New Mexico, guys, we don't have those. We're one of the few states that actually legalize cannabis through the legislature. Most states legalize it through voter ballot initiatives. But what could also happen is you can roll back those same things through the same process. So that's like what kind of like a give and take kind of thing, which is here in New Mexico. It's great that we don't have that because we have to go through our legislature. It's such a small state that it's a little easier than it is like in California. In California, it's like damn near impossible. I've heard from people that, get a hold of your, legislators and stuff. But here in New Mexico, you can lose, elections very easily. So they have no choice but to talk to us. So that luckily that kind of works in our favor because, the only other way we could do it is like through a state constitutional amendment. And those are a pain in the ass to change, when it comes to like law changes and stuff. And even when it comes to the legislative process, we should have went through rules more than the law anyway. A lot of the issues that we have, we probably should have left it up to the rules because you have more chances to change that throughout the year than you do the legislation. So, there's little stuff that goes on in it too. But in Arizona, Massachusetts, Maine, and I think Ohio as well, they all have some kind of voter, referendum where they're going to roll back legalization some way, in those states. Either we're going to roll back no sales, no home grows. We're just going to allow possession, this and that. And, I've heard some people in the cannabis legal space, they're, on the operator side, they say, well, I really wish they'll just make this illegal again, man. It was way easier, blah, blah, blah. This and I was like, I get it, dude, but you're not thinking about the people that went to prison for this and that will, again, be targeted for this. It's like, yeah, you're going to make your money tax-free again and have to deal with the government less, but you're not the one that's going to have to worry about getting arrested as much as the people who are, out in the streets possessing it and stuff. And, that's the reason why we really wanted to go with this. It wasn't just for you to grow your stuff and make money. That was just a perk of this. The real reason is we wanted people to stop being arrested for this and to, choose the substance they want to use. And that's real personal freedom there. But, these certain states, it's unfortunate that we're seeing that. Will these pass? I don't know. I don't think so. Most of the states that, these are going through, they, like I said, went through their voter referendum anyway. So most of them were passed quite popular. They were like, like 60, 70% in passing. So I don't see them going back on it, but you never know. They could, read that and see it a certain way and say, you know what, that sounds better. Let's go vote for that because I don't like this. So what are your thoughts on that by any chance?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think, to see what happened federally with hemp and then to see those same groups going into these states and funding these efforts to repeal the cannabis programs, we've all worked so hard to build. It's definitely tough to see and feels like a huge step backwards. I think, supporters of cannabis are definitely the majority. So my hope is, none of these endeavors will be successful. But you've also got, some really complex and nuanced issues within these programs. And at times, industry folks who support the program's downfall for one reason or another,
Yeah.
And so it's almost like we saw in Florida where they just try to do an adult use voter initiative that did not include home grow, largely
Ugh, that's
because of
terrible.
the single subject rule and all this stuff. But industry folks voted no on that adult use measure because they felt like it failed in so many ways. And even though they personally supported legalizing marijuana, that initiative specifically was not something they could support. So, in pessimistically, I do worry to an extent that between the just straight up prohibitionists who don't support cannabis at all, and then those industry folks who are sort of on the fence, you might see some success, and that of course would be troubling. But we just have to wait and see what happens. I have, tried to engage with some of these groups, and I know other folks have as well. Encourage them to openly debate some of these issues with us. But I think, you're going to continue to see some prohibitionist efforts probably for decades to come. Like, you've still got people who support, repealing alcohol allowances and stuff. So, you're going to see this, but it just exemplifies in my mind why we need to come together. When the industry is split, our defenses are weakened. And as a result, we are more open to these style of attacks. And more importantly, like you pointed out, this is about consumers facing negative consequences of prohibition that still linger. And it could be arrest, it could be losing your job, it could be losing your benefits, it could be losing custody of your kid. Like, there's just so many things that can happen to a consumer of a THC product, regardless of where it comes from. So while we're all, fighting over here and debating the issues, our consumers, our patients, the people we're trying to help are suffering. So, in my mind, we need to remind ourselves of what has worked. And in some instances, that has been, showing how medical access can help various people. In other instances, it's been adults should be free to make their own choices, right? And have that autonomy. Go back to these arguments that work and resonate with people, and hope that these prohibitionist arguments aren't going to win the day. But especially when you've got some bad behavior going on with products, every governor press release thing that you see is just like the bad products right there, and you're just like, oh my god, like, we have got to back off the bullshit and then move forward as an industry together. And I think 99% of the people I talk to are all open to reasonable regulation. And, for hemp, that means coming up a little bit. For cannabis, I think, we've been in this game long enough. We're open to continuing to jump through these hoops, but the reality is that we just shouldn't. Like, seed to sale tracking is not working. It's expensive. Why are we still doing this? Like, it just having some real honest conversations with ourselves. But yeah, I mean, it's troubling to see. I really hate to see anyone ever lose access. But right at the start, you were talking about the executive order talking about marijuana, and that's a term that has a lot of history to it for sure. But marijuana with an H remains a federally controlled substance, as well as THC. Both of those are Schedule 1. And until that is not a reality anymore, until no form of marijuana, cannabis, whatever you want to call it, is a controlled substance, the government will continue to use it as a tool against people. So, we really need to come together and take this tool away from them. It's not like they even need a ton of tools right now to mess with us. Like, they're doing what they want anyway. But let's take away this tool that is used to really punish Americans and people all over the world on a daily basis. Like, people are still deported for state legal cannabis use. Like, this is just a huge, huge issue. So, coming together, joining groups like the One Plant Alliance that I founded with Steve D'Angelo, signing the pledge, supporting the removal of marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, that is going to get us ultimately to where we need to be, where consumers and patients aren't facing the lingering consequences of prohibition anymore.
100%. And before we go, thank you so much again for joining me today. It's been a great conversation. I wish we had more time to break down everything and kind of get into the nitty gritty of things, but we only have so much time, but maybe I'll have you again later on in the season. Of course, next season there's always a chance. But thank you so much, and
Sure.
having your insights is always so relieving, and it's great to hear your perspectives and everything. So thank you so much. And before we go, where can people find you, your business, and also the One Plant Alliance too? We didn't even get a chance to talk about that. Go ahead and you got your however long you need to talk about all that.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn, Instagram. Instagram's at purple_circle_services. LinkedIn is just me. Purple Circle has one too, purplecircleservices.com as well, oneplantalliance.org. But definitely follow me on LinkedIn. As you said, it's really active for cannabis folks. I try to be active on Instagram too, because I know there's a lot of folks on there as well. But hit me up anytime. I'm always down to chat. It was a pleasure speaking with you today, and definitely look forward to keeping in touch.
You too. And, I look forward to, us talking more, and whenever we find out changes, kind of going back and forth to figure out what it means. And I'll keep you guys in the know too as well. So make sure you like, subscribe, whatever you got to do to stay in the know. So I'll see y'all next week with another episode of Ask Chad Grassy Logic. All right, y'all. Shoots.